Kate Ascher and Tom Mellins.
This is the boring part, so I'll be really quick. The pictures are the great part of the book and the great part of our whole presentation. But just so you know how this happened, and then Tom can tell you a little bit about how the book is structured. I teach urban development at Columbia. I came there in 2011 at the same time as the Durst family gave Seymour's Old York Library collection to Avery Library. And there was an existing course at Columbia, I teach at the Graduate School of Architecture and Planning, called A History of American Real Estate, which was so enormous and complex and hard. And I was so not interested in American suburbs. I co-opted the class and taught it and turned it into a class in the history of New York City real estate. And as I started researching New York City real estate, I realized there was no real history book on how the real estate profession and real estate shaped New York. And so I thought, wouldn't it be great if I could use the collection to celebrate that and create almost a textbook for the students to use as they learned about New York's evolution from its Dutch period to today. So that was the original idea. Talked to the dean, he thought it was a great idea, and we decided not only to have a co-editor, co-author, and Tom will tell you about what he brings to it, but also to have contributors from the Columbia faculty. So each of the chapters in the book, and Tom will talk about it, has a contributor who comes along with it, who's an expert in the period, and Carol is too modest to say that she is actually one of them. So there is a Skyscraper chapter, and Carol, of course, is the contributing author of that one. But that's really how the book came to be, and I knew Tom from a variety of previous lives and decided that I certainly could master plan, but I couldn't curate, and I didn't know as much about images and thinking about that, and so that's how Tom came in, and he can tell you a little bit about how the book took shape from there.
Thank you. My connection, as Carol mentioned, starts actually in Avery Library, where I've spent much of my adult life. And what was particularly intriguing to me about this was that it was an opportunity to be on very familiar ground and yet in unexplored territory. The Durst Collection is a massive collection, and I was encountering it for the first time, and I had fantastic guides, among them Kate and of course the staff at Avery Library. And so it was this sort of wonderful combination of old and new for me. I had a personal connection that went back a long time to the Durst family, which was that when I was working on a project decades ago with Bob Stern about Times Square, this goes back to the 1980s, someone told me that Seymour Durst had this fantastic material and that I should really contact him. Among other things, it was about the sort of dark side of Times Square, not from when we all remember it in the 60s and 70s and 80s, but going back to the beginning of the century. So even then, it was very much of a kind of mixed bag. So I called Mr. Durst and I explained who I was and what I was doing. At this time, the collection was housed in his townhouse on 62nd Street on the east side, 5 stories, full of books. Wasn't quite the Collier Brothers, but it was close. There were books in bathtubs, there were books in kitchen cabinets, there were books everywhere. So Mr. Durst said, sure, please come over, I'm going to leave the front door open. It was a hot September day. I go in, I'm finding fantastic material in unlikely places. The collection is organized in a very idiosyncratic way. His own terminology, it was almost like going into someone else's brain. He had multiple copies of many books because he wanted to put them in different sections. His interest was not just in the architecture and urbanism. He had whole troves of material on the role of women, the changing role of women, public health, all sorts of subjects. Finding great material, I go up to the 2nd floor, finding more great material, but no Mr. Durst. Go up to the 3rd floor, more great material, no Mr. Durst. Eventually I get to the top floor, I still have not seen Mr. Durst, and I see there's a ladder climbing up to this, to the roof. So I climb up, and there on a tar paper beach it is Mr. Durst, shirt off, on a lounge chair with a reflector catching the rays, says, hope you found everything that you need. And I say yes. And so it was a real kind of New York story. In terms of how we translated that material into a book, as Kate said, we invited 10 scholars, most of them with strong associations with Columbia, to respond to the material. And what that involved was, before any writing could could happen, either on the part of the scholars or on our part, was that, in a sense, miniature exhibitions had to be formed. And these were formed for very small audiences, essentially for ourselves and for the scholars. So with the help of the Avery librarians, we culled this material and created collections of visual items, textual and visual items. And then the scholars would come to Avery Library and respond to the material. And they would sift through the curated collection, and we invited them to respond to the material, not just as scholars, but in a personal way, to derive from the material some narrative, some story that they wanted to tell. And then there was a back and forth where we would add material and subtract material, etc. I've curated exhibitions for quite a long time, and it's kind of common knowledge that a good exhibit is not simply an essay or a book on the walls, that it has a physical presence. I think of this as almost the reverse, which is a kind of series of exhibitions between book covers. It's very visually driven, the text is very visually driven, and punctuating these portfolios with the contributors' essays, in a sense, in the form of extended captions. Kate and I have provided a kind of historic framework that allows the reader to have some context for these more personal meditations on the city. So tonight's presentation will actually very much mirror the book in the sense that our comments will be visually driven. We didn't come up with comments and then illustrate them. We have the illustrations, these incredibly rich items from the Durst Collection, and then we'll attempt to explain them in some fashion. So.
Great. So we're going to take you on a little travelogue, I guess, of New York City history. They're pretty random, the ones we pulled. We're familiar with the material. I have this paper here because I don't know the exact dates. Some of them are very small. I don't remember them all. So the first of the 10 chapters that Tom talked about takes us back to the days of the Dutch. The contributor here was a fellow named Russell Shorto. Some of you may know him because he wrote a wonderful book, Island in the Center of the World, which is a wonderful book. He is not affiliated with Columbia, but because he's such an expert in the Dutch, we thought we really needed him to look at this material. So again, I'm not sure if there's a laser. Oh, I did something wrong. There we go. I'm not going to try to use this as a laser pointer. I just want to point out, I think what I'll do at least as we go through my chapters is just point out 2 or 3 things about each of the images here. So this is the original New Amsterdam, and you actually can see here, it's hard to read, but it says, I don't know, something like City of New York or New Amsterdam. It was New Amsterdam, and you'll note the wall at the top of it, which was, of course, where Wall Street was formed, and that was really to sort of to protect the city and sort of to keep the animals from grazing outside of that area. So that's worth noting. And the date on this, the Duke's Plan, is 1664. So by that point, it had been Dutch. It was in that period when it was going back and forth between being Dutch and English. The other thing you'll note is all the boats. I'm a big maritime person. All the boats on the east side, on the eastern tip of Manhattan. And that was because that's where the original port was. The original port in Manhattan was at the foot of Broad Street. And the reason it was there as opposed to on the west, does anybody know?
Deepwater.
No. But
Expansion.
Cold.
did somebody
Expansion
say
of the west side.
about temperature? No, it is actually because at that time the Hudson River froze. But the East River moves too fast to freeze. They didn't have the ice-breaking technology, so you couldn't put those small vessels over there reliably. Of course, that didn't last long, and as soon as boats got bigger, it wasn't a problem. But the East River runs pretty fast. It is deep. They're both deep. And so that's where the original port was. So that's interesting to note as well. The other thing you can see is the role of the fort, of course, at the bottom, because this was a little commercial place. It wasn't a big city. It was there because the Dutch West India Company put it there for trading purposes. So that's the Duke's Plan from 1664. Okay, here is the Jacob Leisler House. And you'll notice it says on the Strand, now Whitehall Street. Whitehall was actually the name of Stuyvesant's house when he was the governor. But it's notable because it was, as you can see, the first brick dwelling erected in the city. Why was that important? It was important because pretty much up until that time, most things were, if they weren't dirt, they were wood. and wood, of course, would stay for quite a while, and it would burn down regularly, particularly around Wall Street, which had 2 great fires. But just a couple of things to note is, the presence of walls, the sort of density of this little community. And the other thing to note, and this is important now, Carol and I actually have been talking a lot and thinking about the street grid in Lower Manhattan, is that the streets in Lower Manhattan originally were formed because they were animal paths. They were just kind of where animals wandered and how these kind of higgledy-piggledy houses that were there at the very beginning were set up. Okay, so that is 1663. This is now, we've moved ahead to 1746. This is largely, but not entirely in chronological order. So this is the view of New York from Brooklyn. Okay, so Brooklyn was not yet a city either. It would become a separate city. And again, you can note that there's a lot of maritime traffic, both commerce and transportation on the East River. You're a little bit north of here. You're essentially at Fulton Street. You're near where the Brooklyn Bridge would be built, 140 years later. And I guess the one thing you can note is, even though at this point it was very much an English colony, this is 1746, so obviously before the Revolutionary War, you can still see the Dutch architecture, because of course it was Brooklyn, and that was a Dutch word originally and spelled very differently than we spell it today. This is the Ratzer map from 1767, and there's a bunch of stuff. I won't go through everything here, but you can see the original street grid. We'll come down to the width of the tip of the island later, and you can recognize some of the streets, certainly where City Hall is. Of course, the Collect Pond and what was then fresh water existed. That was the first drinking supply in New York, or reliable drinking supply. It didn't stay fresh, for long. It stayed fresh for another 50 years or so. But there's also, and again without a pointer, you can see the name of some of the squares. Delancey is there, Stuyvesant is there. These were the families that were big landowners back at that time, and as that started being developed, their names would be given to a variety of places. The other thing to note is you can see that there were shipyards here. Again, there were shipyards in Brooklyn as well. There are shipyards here in what is today sort of the Two Bridges area. And then if you look and you see all the kind of what looks like grassy, watery areas, that was not thought to be at that time really developable. It was left as marshy areas. Of course, it would be developed, and you can see all of the water. Remember, this was pre-grid, so nothing was leveled. There was very natural features still, which of course wouldn't remain forever. So there's some odd things that I don't really know I haven't really researched, and you can see that Greenpoint is referred to over there. Greenpoint we think of as in Brooklyn, but there's Greenpoint mentioned here. So this is sort of a little picture of what we call laying the groundwork, and now I'll just continue because this was sort of another one of my chapters. We then move into what we call the formative years. This was a section, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Hilary Vallen's wonderful book about the grid. Hilary, this was, I assume, one of her last efforts, and she did the captions for this chapter, and of course there's nobody who knew more about the grid, and that was really the main thing happening during this period. This is the 1854, you can see city and county map. And there's a few things to note here. You can see that at this period, Brooklyn is pretty well developed as well. Brooklyn would remain a separate city from New York until the 5 boroughs were brought together in 1898, 1899. And you can see that by this point, the grid has been imagined, and you can see it's all of a sudden become this rectilinear kind of plan for the length of Manhattan Island. And again, most of what we're doing here in this book is around Manhattan. It's not around the outer boroughs. I should have said that kind of going in. The way that the images of development were conveyed, or the convention of map making at that time, was that the areas that were developed were kind of gray. So these were actually developed areas that you see in gray. And then the white really didn't exist. The commissioner's grid imagined this grid to go all the way up to 155th Street in Manhattan, and ultimately it would. But it didn't get built out until such time as there was development pressure, and there were neighbors who wanted to pay whatever the fees were to get the streets built, have houses moved, and all sorts of things moved. So what you see in gray was actually built out. What you see in white was for the grid, but not yet developed. And this is 1827. So the grid was formally, announced in 1811. 18, however many years, 16 years later, you can see that it's starting to be realized, okay? And that's really everything above Houston Street. So this is a view of Broadway, and this is around the same time. It's actually dated 1831. I actually work with BuroHappold, an engineering firm, regularly, and our offices are right across from Trinity Church. This is an earlier version of Trinity Church, which burned down a number of times, but the most recent Trinity Church, the one that everybody's coming to see Alexander Hamilton's tomb and all the rest of it, is 1845. So it's 14 years later. But what you can note is that Lower Manhattan was in those days really a kind of mixed-use community. It wasn't yet just a commercial zone. You can see that's a hotel right there, and I guess there's carriages waiting to take people. There's a piano warehouse over here, there's trees, and you can see it's sort of a rather lovely picture of this mixed-use community on Lower Broadway. As we move further, and this is about 20 years later, Central Park, of course, becomes a defining feature of Manhattan. It was not part of the grid plan. It was probably the biggest violation of the commissioner's plan for New York and how New York would evolve. Thankfully so. This is actually almost a sort of map that was done by surveyors of what was there before Central Park would be created by Olmsted and Bucks, who had their sort of greensward plan. So that first one actually dates from 1856. The proposal to move ahead with Central Park was debated in the 1850s, late 1850s. It really was, I think they were awarded the right to develop their plan in about 1858. So you can see it was scrubbed, there were people living there was a lot of animals. It was not it wasn't a prime piece of real estate, but it would obviously be one. This is the change in really just 13 years. So by 1870, when the park was open, you could see that people were really using it. It's a lovely image of Central Park Lake, which looks sort of similar today, just that people don't dress as fancy. And, you know, we have different little boats that are moving around. But this is really sort of the beginning of what would be the real estate push around Midtown Manhattan, and Central Park certainly helped in that.
I have a question on the last one.
Sure.
The fountain, the Bethesda fountain, is that really the power that Bethesda fountain could conjure up in that day, or is that a little exaggerated?
I don't really know. It's a good question. So the date of that particular image is 1869. So, I mean, there were fountains in 1869. I don't know if there was actually one there. I imagine there was, or they wouldn't have painted it, but I don't know.
But it had that much water. I mean, it's more than you have today.
The other question is, did it have healing powers?
Over to you, Tom.
Okay. Throughout the book, there is for us an ongoing dialogue between the images and the stories. So before I talk about the story of this image, I just want to say that the images that we've seen up till now give begin to tell the sweep of the kind of visual information that we were encountering. So in other words, this is up until this image, it's all pre-photography, but there are maps, there are engravings, there are things that were published, there were things that were one off of, and so that also is a part of the development of the city and how we think of the city. Photography changes everything. This is actually a postcard image. Mr. Durst was extremely fond of the full range of material. He was not a snob in that way, in the sense that it's not all intellectual material. He was equally interested in postcards as he was very valuable and rare maps. It had nothing to do actually with the monetary value. It was all about telling the story as far as he was concerned. This begins the story of the rise of the apartment. I should just say that each chapter, they trace a chronological arc, but they are not within the chapters strictly chronological. They're thematically organized. So we pulled out major themes of what makes New York, New York. And one of those facts is the fact that we all live in apartments. Virtually all of us live in apartments. But what we forget is that the apartment is really a rather recent invention. It's only in the 1880s that large numbers of New Yorkers start living in what we think of as apartments. This image of Orchard Street from around 1900 shows the streets serving as far more than conduits of traffic. They're full of push carts. It's all about commerce. And they're lined by tenement buildings that go up to 6 stories. And it was estimated by some people, particularly by housing advocates, people who were working to provide improved conditions for New Yorkers of modest means. It was estimated that this, at the time, at the turn of the century, was actually the most densely populated place on Earth. Whether or not they could actually document that, housing advocates in 1900 were saying that it was more densely populated than the slums of Bombay. We can go back a few decades. It's right after the Civil War that the government starts to get involved in housing. It doesn't get involved originally in terms of the economics of it, in terms of providing housing for the poor per se, but it enters the realm of housing through public health. If you look at this image, you can see it as a kind of petri dish of communicable disease. And the apartments are not well ventilated, it's incredibly crowded, there isn't natural light entering many of the rooms inside, and it's through public health. It's actually when wealthy people start to be concerned that diseases such as tuberculosis and cholera, which are known as the diseases of the poor, will affect not just the poor, but affect them, that they start to try to regulate housing in New York. This image from 1909, so just a little bit later than the first image, shows a street that is lined on one side by 3-story tenements and on the other by 2-story dwellings. The buildings on the left house 3 families. The buildings on the right each house 2 families. You might say, well, what difference does that make? Well, the significant difference is that the 2-story, 2-family houses were considered private dwellings, and the 3-story, 3-family are considered multiple dwellings, and consequently they fall under the aegis of the laws that are beginning to say what defines decent human habitation. This chapter, by the way, the contributor to this chapter was Andrew Dolkart, who is an expert in this, and he contrasted, he chose these 2 plans because he wanted to really bring home what was the difference between regulated spaces and unregulated spaces. On the left, we see the typical floor plan of a 2-family house, and you can see that the rooms in the center, these 2 bedrooms, have no light, have no air. They are completely interior. By law now, a space in a New York City apartment is not considered a room unless it has a window, but this predates that. If you see on the, you can contrast that with the plan that we see on the right of a 3-family dwelling, and this space has been created. Now, it's not a generous space, it's not a garden space, but it is nonetheless a light well, and it provides, so now all of the rooms have some natural air and light. Okay, now we're jumping ahead, but actually not as far ahead as you would think. The tenements that we're looking at in 1900 and 1909 are built only a few years, really, before suddenly many New Yorkers, most New Yorkers, are living in apartments, and many New Yorkers are living high in the sky. So here we see a particularly New York type, which is the apartment hotel. It's not a hotel in the sense that we think of today as accommodation for transients, but this is for long-term residents and permanent residents. On the left we see Sherry Netherlands at 5th Avenue and 59th Street by Schultz and Weaver. And on the right, the Panhellenic Hotel on Mitchell Place, and 1926 and 1927 respectively. And here we see that the skyscraper is utilized as a dwelling. It took some time for New Yorkers to get used to that idea. The idea for apartments, as we think of them, actually comes from Paris. In New York, they were sold as French flats. It took a while to convince people of means that they actually wanted to live next to strangers. But when they did, they did so with great enthusiasm. And one of the aspects of the image on the right, the Panhellenic Hotel, that's particularly interesting is a subset of apartment hotels were designed for single women. Educated single women who were coming to New York in the 20s in unprecedented numbers to work outside the home, and it was considered that they needed a safe environment to live in. And the name of the hotel, the Panhellenic, refers to the fact that many of these women were sorority sisters. And so it's the Greek letter sororities that the name reflects.
Great. Okay, so now we're on to another one of my favorite subjects, which is transportation. And for this, we looked to a fellow named David King, who actually is at Arizona State right now, but was teaching in Columbia's planning department at the time we did the book. And he's a transportation expert. And he came to his little exhibition that Tom mounted for him in Avery Library and decided that what he wanted to write about was not just transportation, but transportation inventions that didn't happen. So what public transit might have looked like in New York if things had gone differently. So this is actually, believe it or not, something that really did get invented and let's just call it piloted. It was from 1867. The guy's name was Charles Thompson Harvey. And this is downtown, because that's where everybody thought there would be a lot of congestion, on Greenwich Street. And so if it looks like a sort of forerunner of the elevated railroad, the L that characterized New York for many decades, it is. It didn't last, it wasn't successful, but there was a lot of people, as you can see down below, who came out and looked at it. Okay, and this is 1867. I don't have an image, I'm sorry, of the other transportation invention that didn't really see the light of day in a couple of ways, which was Alfred Beech's pneumatic tunnel, which is also downtown, which was sort of built at stealth of night and whisked people in a vacuum tube from one station to another. He only had a license to move freight, but he started moving people in the late 1860s, and then there was an economic downturn in 1872 and it was all too expensive. I have yet to actually get to see that tunnel, but I am told that the original tunnel for that pneumatic tube is still there, downtown, not very far from here. This is not an image of that. That was down below.
Do you know where it's exactly?
Murray Street.
Yeah, it's Murray Street. It's not very far from here.
It's the remnants were located when they were digging the City Hall station for the BMT. They found actually the remnants of it, so whatever's left is may have survived the construction of that site.
Right. And there's been lots of construction downtown, so who knows. But this was 1867. This did not get built, okay? This is an image of something fanciful. It was from 1833, though, so it was 30 years earlier. And this is the idea of an elevated rail line running alongside, or almost as part of, these buildings. So the idea was that streets were very crowded. If you remember the image that Tom showed you that was much later, streets were crowded. They were crowded with horse cars, they were crowded with omnibuses, they were crowded with commerce, they were crowded with people walking. There were no lanes, there were no one-way streets. There was just everything happened in the street. Waste was disposed in the street, everything. So I guess way back when, the idea here from 1833, we don't have the name of the author of this railroad or the inventor. He proposed an elevated railroad that would run right alongside real estate and really be built into it. It didn't happen in the subways, of course.
There's an elevated in the Bronx on Simpson Street that looks almost like
Really?
that. Yeah,
That's
it
neat.
goes around the bend, and the subway literally like hugs the edge of the apartment building.
Wow.
So, I mean, it reminds me of Simpson Street in the Bronx.
Yes, yeah. So we do have, the legacy of the elevateds are very much still around us in some of the outer boroughs. So then this is jumping ahead to sort of 1920. So the subway actually opened in 1904. The first line opened in 1904. Cars, of course, started making the rounds. You can see by this period, by about 1920, there aren't really a lot of horses on the road. Certainly in this image, there aren't horses on the road. And you see a variety of both public transit, which is what these sort of former buses look like, and early cars. But of course, for a very long time, there was no real traffic control, and David talks about this, that people went wherever they wanted in the street. There was no state of the right, state of the left, it was just chaos. So this is in a period when they're starting to rationalize how people move. So you can see the beginnings of lanes. You also see an early traffic control system. So there's some kind of traffic cop in here, and the beginnings of traffic lights. So originally there was a person that held up, whether it was a red, yellow, green light, I don't know what it was, stop, go, to have people move in some kind of synchronized form, because otherwise nobody was going to ever cross the street. And this is, again, looking north on 5th Avenue from 42nd Street. So if you imagine this is 1920, and then this is, you know, not very much later, this is 2 decades later, and essentially the car has completely taken over. By this point, you can see that the crazy streets that Tom had shown us, where you had people walking in the street and commerce and everything else, streets, this is 1st Avenue, looking north from 47th Street. So all of that life of the street, from David's perspective, has been robbed by our devotion to the automobile and its needs. And even though we think that an underpass is a great idea because it keeps everything moving, you can see the sort of sterility of, you know, there's no retail really that's visible along here, and it's all about fast movement. And of course, this is late 40s, you know, right at the dawn of what would be, you know, the highways in the 50s and cars and the movement to the suburbs. So it really kind of tells a story of how the city is changing. And of course, the city would be impacted very negatively by people leaving the city and by the construction of highways ultimately. I'm going to walk through this, and I'm hoping that my echo back here doesn't correct me, because I will get things wrong. Even though I wrote a book about skyscrapers, every word of my book was vetted by Carol, and I learned more in Carol's vetting than I did in the writing of the book. But we have picked some images here. This is Carol's chapter, of course, because there's nobody else I would go to caption anything about skyscrapers. This is an image from 1870. What is funny about this image?
Brooklyn Bridge.
The Brooklyn Bridge did not exist in 1870. When did the Brooklyn Bridge open? 1883. Wow, this is a super Does anybody else want to do this talk? 1883. Luckily, I knew that. Luckily, I like bridges too and knew that. So this is done in 1870, and it's actually, the name of it is Bird's Eye View of the southern end of New York and Brooklyn, showing projected suspension bridge over the East River from the western terminus in Printing House Square. That's a very long name of an image, but that is the image. So it's 1870, so it's trying to imagine what the bridge would look like when it is built. And you can see that it's very, very dominant in terms of its height. What's really notable is when you move down to the south a little bit on the island, you can see that Trinity Church was, for good reason, the tallest structure. It had to be the tallest structure, even though we didn't have formal zoning until 1916. Nothing could be taller than Trinity Church. The first thing that was built down here that was as taller than Trinity Church, were I call them the spires, but the towers of what would be the Brooklyn Bridge, and that wasn't until 1883. So it's kind of an interesting perspective. It's of course almost an aerial view, a bird's eye view, but there were no airplanes and birds couldn't paint. So it was it's interesting to think about how someone looked at it and imagined it. And you can see how Brooklyn, the far reaches of Brooklyn, and of course Staten Island, are still verdant and green, and you can see that there's not much else that's green downtown at this point. Okay, so this is Newspaper Row, which, you know, people who come from abroad and travel around and look at, you know, 9/11 Museum downtown would never have known that this was a newspaper district. And it's a little bit hard to read, but you can see the World and the Sun and the Times. Everybody had buildings here. Newspapers were important, newspapers were powerful, and newspapers wanted to be close to power, and of course City Hall was right there. So this was a moment in time when you started seeing skyscrapers as commercial emblems of the buildings behind them. You can see City Hall Park, and of course this is actually dated 1893. The municipal building would be, when was the municipal building?
1903.
I think it's just after, it's within a decade or so, and of course that would dominate once that was built, but before then it was all about these newspaper buildings. And I just note that it is made in Germany. So wherever Seymour traveled, he would pick up this stuff, particularly the postcards. So that's German. So this is really interesting. I have, Carol uses this in her wonderful book, so you may be familiar with it, but this is actually a map of Lower Manhattan that shows, I teach real estate, the real estate values. The per square foot values in 1903. I think this is my favorite image in everything, just because it says so much, and I don't know if you can actually read them, but you can see that the highest value, 350, I don't know what it is, dollars a square foot, whatever it is, square foot, is at the intersection of William Street and Wall Street. William and Wall was the epicenter of the world, and if you look at how fast the values drop off, you can see FIDI, the financial district is where everybody wants to be, that's where the commercial towers were, but the west side was, nobody wanted to be there. Nobody wanted to be there because it was sort of grotty. Nobody wanted to be there because by that point, what's happened on the edge? Tons of docks and tons of commerce. So it was kind of grotty. But that kind of hub, right up Nassau Street, Williams Street, particularly along Wall Street, was really where everybody wanted to be. So that's the 1903 values. And you can see the proximity to City Hall and City Hall Park. And you can also see how low the values are as you move north, and again, as you move to the East River. So this is a French postcard. You saw German before, this is a French one, the Bâtiment Singer, which is the Singer sewing machine company. This is actually from 1908, or the building was opened in 1908, and it was quite a building. It was actually set back, before we actually talked about setbacks and the virtue of setbacks, it was set back from the street. It was an absolutely beautiful building that existed for a very long time, but as early as 1960, the Singer company found, like many companies found, that the floor plates were not right for what it needed in a modern 1960 business. So it sold the tower to, I think it was US Steel, and it would come down by 1968. So the landmarks, when was the landmarks law? This is such a knowledge.
65.
So the landmarks law happened, but not fast enough, because or it didn't get implemented in a way that could stop the Singer building from coming down. Does anybody know what is there now?
Liberty
It's One Liberty Plaza.
One Liberty Plaza.
It's One Liberty
I
Plaza.
think it's still the tallest building ever built to actually be torn down as opposed to.
I think that's
For a little
right.
while.
I think that's right, although I don't know what they're doing in China and other places, so you never know. But yes, technically it's the tallest building to be taken down.
41.
How many?
41.
41 says right there, it's on.
Oh yeah, 41. 41 etage. Okay, so here is the skyline of New York City, and this is 1915 or so. So you can see that, you see, well, it must be 1960. You can see the Equitable Building, which is the double building. I'll show you another image of that. You can see the Woolworth Building, and you can see these sort of skinny towers are characteristic of everything. You can also see the ferry terminals. The Hoboken Ferry Terminal is still there, which looks very much like that ferry terminal, which no longer exists. So this is just another example of the beautiful postcards that Seymour collected. And again, the interesting thing about the collection is he didn't collect over his entire life. I think he was, in his 60s? Late 50s or early 60s when he started collecting. And his first, I gather the first thing he bought was a book or something in Paris. And then for the next couple of decades, he collected voraciously. So here's the Equitable Building and the Singer Tower. The Equitable Building is, of course, this sort of H-like building that was put up from 1912 to 1916, and which, most people agree played a large role in helping to get the first zoning regulation passed in 1916, primarily because the real estate industry downtown did not want it built. Why did they not want it built? Because it was a spec building and it was going to steal all the tenants. And there were some people who liked the fact that it had been open space when the earlier low slum 7-story Equitable Building burned down. There was a nice open space, and there's not a lot of open space down there. So people didn't necessarily want to build in the real estate industry, just like they didn't like the idea of the World Trade Center being built. When the World Trade Center was built years later, thought this was an awful lot of real estate to dump on on the market. But it did open in 1916, and of course is still there, known as 120 Broadway today. Okay, and here is a map, the Fairchild aerial survey view of Manhattan. This is 1931, and so you can see that the bridges across the East River have been built out. You can see the docks are going strong everywhere, all the way up, both east and west sides, particularly the west side has come into its own. But the real thing to note here is that it is no longer just all about Lower Manhattan. The skyscraper fever has moved to Midtown as well. So we're now in the 30s, we're now in the race to be, the tallest, in some senses the biggest, but this is really, of course, what you can do when you actually can get in an airplane and have a real aerial view. So this is a fabulous map, and the collection, a fabulous photograph. The collection has wonderful aerial photographs that are huge and really, really beautiful. And then here, of course, we use this on the cover of the book, the Empire State Building, which Carol knows all about, but not only the tallest, but probably the biggest. This was the Chrysler Building, which held the title of tallest building in the world for how long?
6 months.
Something like that. Okay. And what was the building that it was racing against when it went up?
41.
Which is now known as? I didn't say it, but it is known as the Trump Building. So this is like the most knowledgeable audience ever. Carol has clearly primed her well.
We have a following of New York City.
Oh, I don't even know why I'm talking up here. In any case, okay, so there's, for the few of you who don't know, there is the Chrysler Building, and when it went up, it was in a race to be the tallest building in New York City against a downtown building on 40 Wall Street, and 40 Wall Street thought it was the tallest, and then Walter Chrysler stuck his spire through the roof, and he kept it a secret, and he got those extra feet, and he became the tallest building for less than a year before the Empire State Building opened in 1931. So
The building's on sale now.
the Empire State Building?
No, the Chrysler Building.
I can't afford it.
It's on sale.
It's on sale.
Maybe do it in installments.
Okay, over to you, Tom.
Yes, I have to say that now I am thoroughly intimidated by that. And two things come to mind. One is that for an odd moment I felt like I was in a house of worship and there was like a response of reading and falling apart. The other is that a number of years ago it was my great pleasure to curate an exhibition on the history of Philip Johnson's New York State Theater at Lincoln Center, which was built as a house for the ballet. And I gave many tours, and among them I gave a tour to a group of ballet dancers from the City Ballet. And I have to tell you, I don't know if everyone can see my feet, but the entire time I was talking, I felt like I should be doing this. And so I don't know exactly what the equivalent to see is here, but so, housing the people. There's a chapter, we invited Hilary Sample, who's a practicing architect who teaches a housing studio at Columbia, to talk about the way in which New York has really been a national leader in public and affordable housing, going back to 1934 when the New York City Housing Authority is founded. 3 years before there's a U.S. Housing Authority. Everyone knows about how crazy expensive domestic residential real estate is in New York, but what we forget is that there is this legacy as well. This image is from 1950. And what it shows, interestingly, is the amount of floor space that was considered to be a minimum in affordable housing. And we see that in 1940, it's considered that each person needs 250 square feet, but the family size is relatively large. It is predicted, and I think accurately, that by 1970 the family size will go down, but demand will actually keep the size of apartments relatively the same because it's considered that each person needs more square footage. In terms of how we think about housing, I think that this represents a kind of natural evolution. If we think about the tenements that we saw previously and the floor plans there, and the concern is preventing communicable disease from spreading, and the emphasis is on ventilation and on light. Now we see sort of the next step, and it's not just about those bare minimums, but it's about what actually is going to be comfortable to occupy. It's sort of raising the standard for what we think of as decent habitation. Hilary Sample was particularly intrigued by this image, which comes from 1934, the year that NYCHA is created, the New York City Housing Authority. And the staff of NYCHA created this diagram. This is an imagined landscape. This doesn't exist anywhere. But what it is showing are the footprints of housing that was built for people of modest means over a period of time. And we start here, we see that the sites, the buildings are very close together and the blocks are very densely developed. And as they develop, the amount of open space in so-called garden apartments gets larger and larger. And this sets the standard for NYCHA, which interestingly, as a public entity, is looking at what private developers had actually done first for a slightly more affluent neighborhood. But they adopt the notion of the garden apartment, and then that morphs into what we think of today as the towers in the park. This is, I think, a wonderful illustration. So we go from an imagined landscape to a real landscape in Harlem. And this image, which is from an article about the Harlem River houses, which is one of the first three developments of NYCHA. The first is actually not technically a new building. It's called First Houses, and it was a renovation of existing tenements on the Lower East Side, where in that case what they did is they took out every third building to create, to in a sense transform existing tenements into garden apartments. And then the first two purpose-built developments of NYCHA are Harlem River Houses, which was exclusively for a black clientele, and the Williamsburg houses in Brooklyn, which was exclusively for a white clientele. So this contrasts the so-called old law tenements, the very first regulations, which are happening in the 1860s and 1870s, with the so-called new law tenements, where the law is radically revised and the standards are elevated. This is 1901. With Dunbar Apartments, which is a privately funded development for a black clientele. It's sponsored by the Rockefeller family. This is pre-government involvement in housing, but this is beginning to show what the direction that NYCHA will go in. But when NYCHA does it, the courtyards and the open areas become even larger. But this, I think, is just a wonderfully telescopic view of how housing develops in New York City. And this is a plan of the Harlem River houses, where we see that a great deal of care went into the design of early NYCHA developments. They really beautifully articulated where the procession from one space to another is really very seriously considered in what will create an attractive community. It's not just about providing individual apartments. For the making of Midtown, we turn to the scholar Reinhold Martin, who took a very interesting take on what Midtown was all about, and he used as his jumping off point the statue of Prometheus at Rockefeller Center, but without telling you about his narrative strain, the images that we chose to present tonight frame the transformation of Midtown from a mixed-use area with a kind of loose character to a densely commercial area, which still maintained a wide variety of uses, was not exclusively transformed into office space, but one of the drivers of that transformation, of the development of Midtown as we think of it today, was transportation. And we see here the entrance to the Lincoln Tunnel. The Lincoln Tunnel is built in 3 stages, with the first stage now I'm really scared to say what the year is because I know somebody's going to shout out. But in the 1930s, I think it's the late 20s, is the opening of the first tunnel, and there is already the incipient impact of the growth of the suburbs, which doesn't really take off until after the Second World War, but we see even in the interwar period, that's beginning to seriously shape the character of Midtown. And Reinhold Martin was particularly intrigued by the contrast between this and the East Side Airlines Terminal, which many people don't even remember, but it occupied a full block on the east side. And this is where you would take the bus out to the airports. And this represents a sort of greater development of the impact of the car on the city that Kate was beginning to speak about. And Reinhold points out that the shape of this, we all know that the TWA Terminal, Eero Saarinen's great building at Kennedy Airport, is meant to look like a bird to evoke the sense of flight. Reinhold Martin suggests that this perhaps looks like a bus with sort of the curved corners and the streamlined forms. By the time that this image is taken in the 1970s, obviously Midtown has happened. And again, we see the effects of transportation. In this case, what's taken down rather than what's built. The 6th Avenue elevated train line is taken down in the 1930s when Rockefeller Center, that we see to the right, is being built. But it's in the 60s that the avenue is really reimagined as the Avenue of the Americas. Have you ever heard anyone call it the Avenue of the Americas? But there was an attempt to sort of class up 6th Avenue a little bit. And the so-called XYZ buildings are built as an extension of Rockefeller Center. And they, among other things, reflect changes in the zoning law. The first zoning law, the first comprehensive zoning law in the country is, as I think Kate mentioned, 1916 in New York. In 1961, it's reimagined. And rather than getting the setback towers, you get these buildings rising without setback on plazas, setback from the avenue. I think it was Norman Mailer who talked about those spaces as the empty landscape of psychosis. So, not everyone's favorite buildings. This, I think, is a wonderful image. This actually, I think, comes from a newspaper morgue. And Seymour Durst looked to when many of the New York papers were closing and they were disseminating the material, he was focused on acquiring it and preserving it. And here we see Grand Central Station, one of the great gateways to the city and a reflection of the City Beautiful movement. With the Pan Am building, again, another building that people love to hate, although I think that young people now like it, now that brutalist architecture is in, and we see the Pan Am building. And in a sense, these two buildings, one a fixture of New York, which was threatened with demolition, and particularly people were fearful that it would be demolished or radically changed after what seemed unimaginable, the destruction of Pennsylvania Station had happened. So this is sort of one moment in New York City, or in a sense, two moments in New York City, the City Beautiful movement and then the beginning of the preservation movement. And here we see contemporary New York, modern New York, post-war New York rising above it.
As you drive by,
And meanwhile,
Yes, exactly. Urban Renewal. For Urban Renewal, we turn to Richard Plums. There was who wrote what I think is widely considered, I certainly consider it to be the definitive work on housing, the history of housing in New York. And there was a massive amount of material about urban renewal, particularly Robert Moses' effect on the city. But Richard Plums decided to focus on Lincoln Center as emblematic of urban renewal efforts in New York, and particularly as reflective of the career of Robert Moses, who begins with the great parks and parkways on Long Island, Jones Beach being perhaps the jewel in the crown, and then has a massive impact on the city in terms of highway development and in terms of housing. I think that his contribution in terms of housing is perhaps undervalued, the actual number of units that he provided. But Richard focused on Lincoln Center. And here we see two Bromley maps from the 30s and the 1970s of the same area, directly to the west of Lincoln Center, what was known as San Juan Hill. And it was the preeminent African-American neighborhood, or the largest African-American neighborhood in the city before the rise of Harlem. And we see that the streets are, the blocks are densely developed. And then this is contrasted with what happens first in the 1940s when NYCHA builds the large Amsterdam houses. There's community opposition, significant community opposition to this. The black community is concerned about being displaced. Rightfully so. The Amsterdam houses is nearly exclusively white when it's built in the 1940s, particularly populated by returning GIs. But this is just, in a sense, the beginning of the transformation of that neighborhood, because it's in the 1950s that under Robert Moses's master planning, the area is really reimagined as the Lincoln Square urban renewal area. It's an L-shaped property, and here we see what becomes Lincoln Towers. Now you're talking about massive displacement. 7,000 families are displaced. They're replaced by 4,400, of which only 400 are low-income families. This is happening under Title I, which comes out of the Housing Act of 1949, the so-called Fair Deal, Truman's Fair Deal. But fair is, I guess, a relative word because it turns out, and it starts with a focus on low-income people, but it really ends up being for middle and upper middle income people. What many people don't know about Lincoln Center and the Lincoln Square urban renewal area is that the innovation of it is not that whole precincts are being torn down and rebuilt, but that a key component of urban renewal is not just housing, but culture. That's the innovation of Lincoln Center. And here we see an early proposal for what Lincoln Center might look like, with a circular plaza rather than a square one. But what many people don't know is that if that hadn't happened, if Moses and various other people, the Rockefellers, had not been able to get the many cultural institutions to cooperate with each other, and at the time that the Philharmonic and the Met signed on, somebody said it's as if Macy's and Gimbel's had merged. So this was no mean feat to get Lincoln Center to happen, but if it hadn't happened, the whole area still would have been redeveloped, and it would have simply been more towers of the Lincoln Towers, more elements of that. Here we see the Lincoln Towers brochure for the opening, and this is typical of the kind of things that Durst collected. In fact, the whole range that we're seeing in this section, from urban renewal reports to real estate prospectuses, this is the kind of thing that caught his eye. And so this is from the opening of that development. And Flunz then moves beyond Lincoln Center to talk more about the development of Robert Moses' career, and particularly contrasting it with the influence of Jane Jacobs, who wrote, of course, the seminal book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. What year was that published in?
1961.
There you go, 1961. And so he begins to tell that story, and to look at that battle and sort of how it evolves. He goes down to Lower Manhattan to look at proposals for the Lower Manhattan Expressway for Lomex, and this would have run along Broome Street, would have decimated what we now think of as Soho, which had yet really to be discovered, or was being discovered by artists at that point. And it's the defeat of this proposal that many people look at as the end of Robert Moses's hegemonic hold on the city.
Great. We're almost done. There's only two more. I'll go really fast. We then get into the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and we're really talking about starting to remake in the wake of Robert Moses, parts of Manhattan. It's already been developed, now we're remaking it. So this is a rather sad image of Battery Park in 1914. And you can see it was sort of forgotten. This chapter was done by Ann Buttonwieser, who certainly knows the waterfront of New York and is another scholar affiliated with Columbia. So this was a sort of forgotten Battery Park at the tip of Lower Manhattan in 1914. And once the port started moving to New Jersey in the 60s because of containerization, the burghers of New York City decided they really needed to think about Lower Manhattan's future. So a number of the images that Anne used in this chapter come from a lot of work done by city planning in the 60s, city planning and the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association, another Rockefeller-led group, to look at it. So one of the interesting things, again, this audience may know, but Lower Manhattan is roughly 3 times as wide as it started out. When Eric Sanderson's Mannahatta existed in 1650, you can see how much land there was between the North River, the Hudson River, and the East River. It wasn't much. And you can see how much there is now effectively in 1980. What's really interesting, sad but interesting, is that when Superstorm Sandy hit Lower Manhattan, she essentially, holding Battery Park City aside because it was built higher, flooded the areas up to the original perimeter of Lower Manhattan, which says something about nature taking its pound of flesh. But you can see how much land was built out, both on the sides. Of course, it was built on the tip as well. Battery Park and other things were all sort of landfill that was put in over time. So this is the growth of Manhattan Island. It was done as part of this Lower Manhattan plan. You can see it referred to at the bottom in 1966, when everybody was trying to figure out what is the future of Lower Manhattan if it is no longer strictly related to shipping and commerce and finance that comes along with shipping. When you look across, same document, when you look across during these 30 years from 1950 to 1980, and we're essentially looking north at Wall Street and at the silhouette of the buildings there, and you can of course see the World Trade Center in its original twin tower iteration, and you can see a number of other buildings which are all listed here, but you can see that it grew to the east with tall buildings to the east in the Seaport District, and it grew to the west with Battery Park City, which of course was landfill, some of which was dug from the foundations of the Trade Center. But you really get a sense of how it densified during this period, and it's continuing to densify, although many of the buildings that you see now here as commercial buildings have been or are being converted to residential today because they are no longer suitable floor plates for commercial. So we jump ahead about a decade here, and you can see that the Twin Towers are up. This is 1977. This is an image which I actually love. I want to see if I can read you the name of it. It's from the New York Times, May 16th, 1977, and it's an image called Almost Their Own Beach. And so this is the land and the landfill that would become Battery Park City. But you can see for a long time, because Battery Park City took a very long time to develop for a variety of reasons we won't go into here. The land was there, but there wasn't much going on. And so people were enjoying it as if it were a beach. So it's the contrast between this vast amount of open space, which was potentially tremendously valuable, but couldn't be unlocked because nobody could quite figure out how to fund the development of it. So round about the same time, most of you probably know about the Westway story, which I teach to my students, and they're like, Westway, what's that? Because of course it seems so long ago, they never even heard of it. They know Hudson River Park and they think it's wonderful. I'm like, it's not that wonderful. It could have been really wonderful if it turned out to. But these are 2 images. It's called the Westway Route on new land along the Hudson River. That actually was done by the New York Chamber of Commerce. It was a map showing how the West Side Highway would have been depressed under this new land that would have been created at the river's edge, and it was to be parks, but there was also to be some development there. And of course, it went on for a very long time. The image that you see on the right is from the same effort. It's a Federal Highway Administration map that was part of the review process. It was the outboard alternative. They went through the formal NEPA environmental review process, And it was looking at what that park would have looked like with the highway buried underneath it, just like they've just done in Seattle. And of course, most of you will know this story. It went on with support from virtually everybody, unions, government, everybody, except Al Butzel and a handful of others who found a technical problem with the environmental review and managed to stop the project. And the reason that the project was stopped was not because they were against open space, but it was a lot of federal money that would have gone for cars. At a time when public transit in the 60s and 70s was really struggling financially, and there were a number of people who felt that we should not be spending more money on highways to encourage more cars to come into Lower Manhattan, but that money should be put into public transit. So that project was stopped, and subsequently we have Hudson River Park. So I'm going to turn over to Tom to wrap up.
Can I ask you a quick question? You skipped from the tenements with the horse and buggies straight to the cars. Were there ever trolley cars in Lower
There were
Manhattan?
trolley cars, there were cable cars, there was all kinds of other types of vehicles.
Okay.
So for the last chapter of the book, we turn to the scholar who's was a professor at the School of Business, not the School of Architecture at Columbia, Linda Galen, who's an expert in Times Square. And she talked about remaking Times Square from the 80s to around 2000. The Durst Collection does end. And so there is a point at which it's no longer expanding, but we took it sort of as far as we could. It doesn't come up to the present day. But Lindsay Galen looked at this period where it goes from an area that people were extremely afraid of to once again being a magnet for tourists and New Yorkers alike. For me, it sort of brings the story full circle because, as I said at the beginning, I met Mr. Durst because I was doing research on Times Square, and so it seems appropriate that we end with Times Square. But before Lindsay Galen tells that story, she looks at an image from 1898 of what at that time is still called Longacre Square. That name comes from a street in London. And the principal occupants of Longacre Square, before the theaters move up from lower Manhattan, are carriage makers and stables and things that have to do with horses, and which was true of Longacre Square in London. So they borrowed that name. But then it's reimagined as an entertainment and a theater district. That really takes off starting in the 1880s when the theaters are illuminated for the first time with electric light, and it becomes the Great White Way. And excuse me, it's renamed after a principal commercial tenant, the New York Times. And so it becomes Times Square. It always seemed that it spoke to the character of New York, that two of the principal squares, it's not a city of great squares, but two of the principal squares are named for the newspapers, for the Herald and for the Times. And that always seemed to me to say something about the character of New York. If one of the most fascinating images that we've looked at today had to do with real estate value in Lower Manhattan and how that affected development, this is sort of the flip side of it. This is a vice map of Times Square put together by a commission that's founded by Mayor Lindsay to begin to look at the redevelopment of Times Square. People have been talking about cleaning up Times Square for literally decades and decades and decades, and an enormous amount of public and private funding and thought went into this. The reality is it probably was transformed more by the invention of the video cassette and the fact that you could see certain kinds of movies in the privacy of your own home than the need to go to Times Square. But for whatever reason, it was considered important to actually map out the areas of crime that had begun to really define Times Square. Professor Galen then looks at this postcard image from the 70s and talks about how the fact that movie theaters were not a huge part of Times Square originally, when it was a thriving entertainment district. The great movie palaces tended actually to be in other parts of the city, including the boroughs, but there was a movie presence on Times Square. Movies were also not a huge part of the current redevelopment of it. But in between, starting in the Depression, it becomes a dominant building type in the area. And by the 70s, many of those are no longer showing first-run movies, but they're showing action movies and pornographic movies, and et cetera. And then the final image actually in the book, and the final image of this presentation, was taken by Gary Happ, who, full disclosure, is Lindsay Galen's husband, as well as a professor of urban studies at the University of Pennsylvania. And here we see that Times Square has been transformed in multiple ways, including the fact that the pedestrians have now taken over. It's no longer dominated by the car. There are major corporations from all over the world. And perhaps most importantly, that the tradition of signage, what we think of as the kind of gaudy, blaring, the smoke ring someone's pointing out, all of that comes back not just by government, not just by taste, but actually by government regulation, which requires certain kinds of signage, understanding that while it may not be everyone's taste, it is a defining quality of the area. And the redevelopment of Times Square in many ways suggests a kind of, or reflects a kind of cooperation between private developers and government in a way that's different from that of previous decades and eras that we've looked at today. So in many ways it does encapsulate the current state of New York, not just as a place, but as a real estate adventure as well, which of course is the root of all of this.
And so one question, what is missing from this picture?
Mickey Mouse.
The cartoons, the people walking around.
The naked cowboy.
Oh, the
He's an homage to Vice. You know, he's what's left of Vice. So
He's not there anymore.
He's not recently.
he's still there.
He's still
Anyways, that's it. Great, over to you.
So I'm sure you have many questions, but because we're a little bit long in our chairs, we're having a reception over here. We have books as well, so you can ask individual questions of Tom and Kate. And this was it was a tag team. It was like the 10,000 meter race or something. But we made it through the whole history from the Times Square. So we really thank you so much. Museum.
Yes.
Great, welcome. So I've just been explaining how we've been here in this space, which is our current home since 2004, so going on our 15th year here in Battery Park City. And thank you for coming out tonight. I'm sorry it started to rain on the way down here. It was supposed to rain earlier, which would have discouraged you even more than having already set out. But I know that this time of the year, it always seems like we're kind of at the end of the earth and the dark of the night and kind of the small street lamps. But our wonderful home here in Battery Park City allows us to offer programs like this, both to locals and downtown friends, and to celebrate New York City, which is what we do generally in the lecture series that we hold for those of you who are regulars. Some of you are once a month. Next month still remains to be finally scheduled. But we're hoping that Mark Lamster will be able to come up from Dallas in order to talk about his Philip Johnson book. But if you look through on our website for the subsequent months, you'll see that every month we hold one book talk, authors talks. So we have two authors to talk about one book tonight. And our subjects are always something that has to do with the skyscraper cities, New York history, and especially and real estate history. So we're really like hitting on all cylinders tonight because our two speakers, Kate Ascher and Tom Mellins, are supreme experts in the history of New York and the history of skyscrapers and infrastructure. And I'm going to introduce them tonight not as kind of the scholars with their complete curriculum vitae, but rather as good friends of long standing, as we don't say old friends anymore at our age. But we do go back quite a few years, I have to say. And probably Tom and I the most sort of haunted the lower levels of Avery Library when you took the spiral staircase and cast iron staircase down into the steam heated basement because and in a talk that Tom and Kate gave last week, he reminisced about how many years of his life he spent doing research in Avery Library. So we go back that long time. And Kate has more recently come to Columbia, and so she's a colleague from Columbia. And Kate, I'll circle back to Tom again in a minute, but Kate also has an extraordinary portfolio of experience that she brings to what she does. She has a PhD from London School of Economics, which is about organizations, government and organizations. She kind of flexed that muscle at the Port Authority in New York, and she's been in an enormous amount of other places. But relevant to the books that she has written now and master plan, the books she's master planned over these last few years. Two of them, and now we hope a third, are perennial bestsellers in our bookstore. So The Works, we keep ordering it and ordering, and you know, the stack keeps going down.
I never get royalty.
Yeah, I don't know how that is, actually. So The Works, which is about infrastructure in New York and how everything works, I highly recommend that you get that book too if you don't know it, and that you can find it in our bookstore and get Kate to sign it for you. That was in 2005. So here, only 14 years later, she actually has two other books before this one. It's not even 14 years because this one came out last year. A book on skyscrapers called The Heights, and another book in 2015 on the Way to Go, Moving by Sea, Land, and Air. And that one just slipped under the radar for me. I didn't even know about that one until I found it, you know, kind of in the long list of Kate Ascher publications. And Tom can more than match Kate in the poundage of books. Because he, for many years, was one of the team that produced in the Robert A.M. Stern series of New York 1880, New York 1930, New York 1960, and they kept getting fatter and fatter as each volume, I suppose, as the technology of bookbinding began to improve. So they are both incredibly prolific and knowledgeable authors. So it's really a delight to have them here tonight to double and tag team about this book, New York Rising, which again Kate has kind of master planned, and Tom has streamed in millions of words and characters to organize a book, which as you will see as you look at it is just gorgeously illustrated, all from, as they're going to tell you, the collection of New Yorkiana of the real estate developer Seymour Hirst. And this is a book about the history of New York's urban development, which is the same thing as saying real estate. So, I've spoken enough, and they have some wonderful slides to show you, and they're a lot of fun to listen to because I've heard the spiel a couple times before. So without further ado, Kate Ascher and Tom Mellins.